It's 1999. The internet is still a new and mysterious place, a place where you could be anyone you wanted, and no one would ever know the difference. In the quiet corners of the web, personal blogs and message boards were becoming spaces where people shared their stories and made connections with strangers. And that's where Casey Nicole came in. Casey was a 19-year-old high school basketball star from Kansas. Bright, athletic, and kind, she was the kind of person you couldn't help but root for. Her online presence was magnetic. She wasn't just sharing random updates, she was letting people into her world. With every post, every comment, people felt like they knew her. And they wanted to know her. A big part of Casey's online life was spent on collegeclub.com. At the time, College Club was a new kind of platform where users could sign up for free, create profiles, communicate with each other, and post pictures. Describing herself as a sunny blonde Kansas basketball star, Casey quickly became a standout figure. She was approachable, always ready to chat, and even offered to help out behind the scenes with the site's operations. Her warmth and willingness to engage made her a favorite among the small but growing community. It wasn't long before she became one of the most recognized and well-liked users on the platform. But Casey's story wasn't all sunshine and basketball games. In 2000, she shared something that hit her followers hard. She had leukemia. The news felt like a punch in the gut. Here was this vibrant, upbeat girl, someone people had come to care about deeply, and now she was facing a life-threatening illness. She wrote about how the cancer had been in remission, but it was back, and worse than before. Still, Casey wasn't going to let the disease bring her down. She kept her followers updated on her journey, sharing every step on her blog, Living Colors. Hospital visits, treatments, the long nights of pain. She didn't hold back, but through it all, she stayed positive. "I want to win," she said. "I'll fight to the finish." But as time went on, Casey's updates became less frequent. Her posts grew shorter, more emotional, and sometimes they were written by her mum, Debbie, because Casey was too weak to type herself. Then, in April 2001, things took a darker turn. Casey's health was rapidly declining. According to her blog, her liver was failing, and the end seemed near. Her followers were devastated, but still held on to hope. One of Casey's closest online friends, Randall van der Woning, was desperate to see her before it was too late. He had offered to visit many times before, but Casey always had a reason to say no. Now, he insisted. Casey agreed, but on one condition. Randall would have to wait until she returned from a trip to the ocean. A final trip, she said, to fulfill one of her last wishes before her body gave out. But that visit never happened. On May 15th, 2001, Casey's mother, Debbie, called Randall sobbing. She informed him that Casey had died the day before, unexpectedly, from an aneurysm. Soon after, the news of Casey's death was posted on her blog. "Thank you for the love, the joy, the laughter, and the tears. We shall love you always and forever." Casey Nicole passed away May 14th, 2001, at the age of 19. The internet was in mourning. People who had followed Casey's journey for years flooded the blog with messages of grief, disbelief, and heartbreak. Some even posted obituaries on their own websites, paying tribute to the girl they had never met but had come to care about deeply. But here's the thing. Casey Nicole never actually existed. The girl who had inspired thousands with her courage, the teenager whose battle with leukemia had united a community, she wasn't real. It was all a lie. Behind the screen, there was no brave 19-year-old basketball star. The entire persona had been created by one person, Casey's so-called mother, Debbie Swenson. The photos, stolen. The blog posts, fake. Even the tearful updates about Casey's failing health were nothing but fiction. The girl everyone had rallied behind was never real. The truth started to come out just days after Casey's supposed death. Some people couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cremation happened too quickly. No obituary, no funeral, and no one had ever met Casey in person. A few sharp-eyed internet users started digging deeper, and what they found was shocking. It began with the photos. Casey had posted pictures of herself online, but internet sleuths traced them back to a real high school basketball player, a girl who had no idea her image was being used for this fake story. And then, on May 19th, the truth finally broke wide open. Debbie Swenson made a stunning confession to one of Casey's closest online friends, Randall van der Woning. She admitted that Casey wasn't real. There was no daughter, no leukemia battle. Casey had never existed. The next day, Randall posted the truth on Casey's blog, and the internet community that had been mourning was hit with the cold, hard reality. They had been grieving for a girl who never existed. And that grief turned into anger. How could someone lie about something so personal, so devastating? People demanded answers. They had sent gifts, letters, and even money to Casey and her family. Many of them had shared their own personal struggles with her, believing she was going through the same thing. But as the dust settled, more details of the hoax began to emerge. Debbie Swenson hadn't acted alone at first. The character of Casey was originally created by her real daughter, Kelly, with a few friends as a harmless prank. But when Debbie discovered what they had done, instead of shutting it down, she took it to a level no one could have imagined. She took over the persona of Casey and began building an entire life for her online. She created a world where Casey was not just a cheerful high school athlete, but a brave young woman battling cancer. For 2 years, Debbie played the role, fooling thousands of people, some of whom spoke to Casey over the phone, believing they were talking to a real person. It was a lie so detailed, so carefully maintained, that no one thought to question it. Until now. The internet erupted with outrage. People started connecting the dots, realizing how deeply they had been manipulated. Investigations into the hoax even attracted the attention of the FBI. But because Debbie hadn't profited enough from the scam, there wasn't much they could do legally. Still, the emotional damage was done. For Debbie Swenson, the fallout was immediate and severe. She issued an apology, claiming that she never meant to hurt anyone, that the hoax had spiraled out of control. But her words fell flat. "I knew it was wrong," she said, "and every day it ate at me, but I couldn't stop." But for the people who had believed in Casey, who had supported her through every supposed up and down, the apology wasn't enough. As for Debbie and the blogs, they're no longer with us. Deborah Marie Dickman Swenson passed away in 2020, aged 59. The blogs themselves have been lost in time, with the Wayback Machine only having captured very few snapshots. What's left is those who had encountered Casey and the memories they had of her, being left to grapple with the unsettling truth that the person they thought they knew, the girl they believed they had loved and lost, never truly existed.
Thank you, Ashley. As the police try to piece together the timeline in this case, we're learning more about 14-year-old Ava Wood.
It was just another quiet morning in Baldwinsville, New York, the kind of town where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. You know, the kind of place where neighbors greet each other by name, kids ride their bikes through the streets, and life feels safe, predictable even. But on January 20th, 2023, all of that would change. At a modest house on Triangle Place, a stillness hung in the air. It was the kind of stillness that makes you feel like something's wrong, even though you can't quite put your finger on it. Inside that house lived 14-year-old Ava Wood and her father, Christopher. Ava was your typical teenager, bright-eyed, always on the move, a talented soccer player at school. She had friends, a future, and a life ahead of her that seemed like it was just beginning. But this morning, Ava wasn't at school. The lights in the house were off. There was no sound. And soon, this quiet little neighborhood would be turned upside down by something no one saw coming. The police were called. A welfare check, they said. What they found inside the house would leave the entire town, and eventually the world, asking one question. Why? 16 days earlier, on January 4th, Christopher Wood walked into a store and legally purchased a shotgun. It was a simple transaction. Nothing unusual about it, at least not to anyone on the outside. He filled out the paperwork, paid, and left. But this wasn't a decision made on impulse. This was the beginning of a plan. The tension between Christopher and his estranged wife, Heather, had been building for months. Their separation hadn't been smooth, but it wasn't violent either, at least not in the way you might expect. There had been no physical fights, no outright threats. Instead, it was a slow, simmering hostility. Nearly a year before, Christopher had been involved in a stalking incident against Heather. She didn't want him arrested at the time. She just wanted the authorities to have it on record. A quiet plea for protection, just in case. Then, 2 days before the tragic event, things escalated. Christopher sent Heather a series of harassing text messages. The content of those messages remains private, but they were disturbing enough to make Heather uneasy. The sheriff's office got involved, but the texts had come from a blocked number. There was no way to definitively prove they came from him. The messages were disturbing enough to get the sheriff's office involved, but with no way to trace the sender, there just wasn't enough evidence to take action. And then came the night before. It seemed like a typical evening in Baldwinsville. Cold, quiet, uneventful. But behind closed doors, something much darker was brewing. That night, Christopher made a chilling phone call to Heather. His voice calm, measured. He didn't shout, didn't argue. Instead, he said something that Heather would never forget. This is how it ends for us. 7 words. Simple, cryptic, and terrifying. She didn't know what he meant, not fully. Maybe she thought it was just more of his anger spilling over. Maybe she hoped it was just words. But in that moment, Christopher had made his decision. The house on Triangle Place went dark. Ava, likely unaware of the storm brewing inside her father's mind, was home, maybe winding down for bed, thinking about school the next day. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that this would be her last night alive. The morning after Christopher's chilling phone call, the silence from the Wood house was unsettling. No one had heard from Ava. She hadn't shown up at school. Her friends' texts went unanswered. Something wasn't right. The police were called to perform a welfare check at the Wood residence. They had been to this address before, but this time felt different. The house was locked up tight, curtains drawn, as if the world outside didn't exist. When officers knocked on the door, there was no answer. With no other option, the police forced their way in. What they found inside would haunt the town forever. Christopher Wood was the first to be discovered. His body lay in one of the bedrooms, a shotgun nearby, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But that wasn't all. As the officers moved through the house, they came upon Ava, just 14 years old, lying motionless in her bed. The same shotgun had been used to take her life. Father and daughter, both gone. Christopher Wood had taken the life of his daughter, Ava, before turning the gun on himself. No one knew why. There were no answers, only shock and grief. While the police were working through the tragedy, something strange was happening online. Ava's close friends and family naturally shared their grief on social media. Posts filled with photos and heartfelt messages began to circulate, offering tributes to the girl they had lost. But mixed in with those posts were accounts run by people who had never met Ava. They had no connection to her, no shared memories, no personal ties. Strangers, claiming to honor her, were creating pages dedicated to her life. One of these accounts is Stay Strong for Ava Wood, an Instagram page with 233 posts from the creation of this video, all dedicated to a girl they've never met. And when you check who they're following, it's clear they're not the only one. There are hundreds of these accounts all posting their photos of Ava or uploading their own edited videos, almost as if they were fan cams for their favourite celebrity. Some acted as though they knew her, while others openly admitted they hadn't. They posted photos of Ava, wrote messages, and interacted with each other, almost as if they were part of her story, but they weren't. Some claimed they had been Ava's friends, sharing stories that felt oddly vague, as if they were stitching together pieces of someone they barely knew. Others didn't even bother pretending. They admitted outright they'd never met Ava. Still, they posted every day, photos and quotes, tagging each other like they were all part of the same story. But they weren't. They were strangers. Strangers trying to insert themselves into a tragedy that wasn't theirs. It was hard to tell where genuine grief ended, and this bizarre obsession began. Were they honouring Ava, or using her memory for something else? Their tagline? Just spreading awareness. But was it really about honouring Ava's memory, or was something darker at play? There were growing concerns that people were using this tragedy for personal gain. The sheriff's office had already warned of phishing scams tied to fundraising efforts for Ava's family, but it went beyond money. The idea that strangers were obsessively posting about a deceased 14-year-old girl they'd never known, collecting photos and videos, makes it all feel deeply unsettling. Ava's death devastated her community, a tragedy that left behind heartbreak, confusion, and questions that may never have answers. Thousands of dollars have been donated to help them, and the streets have filled with people attending vigils and prayer services in her memory. But even here, in the outpouring of genuine support, there's a dark twist. Strangers, people who never knew Ava, have taken her story and turned it into something else entirely. A space where grief meets obsession, where attention becomes currency, and where a 14-year-old girl's life has been turned into content for people who never even knew she existed. Phishing scams, fake fundraisers, people exploiting grief for profit. The truth is, in the shadowy corners of the internet, tragedy doesn't always stay sacred. It can become warped, turned into a spectacle, consumed by people who were never part of the story. Ava's memory, once held by those who loved her, now floats through a world of strangers, people collecting likes, shares and followers on the back of her loss.
Janelle Matthews will turn 13 in 2 weeks. No one knows where she'll spend her birthday. She remains one of a growing number of abducted children.
It's late 2020. Robin Warder, host of the true crime podcast The Trail Went Cold, is scrolling through his Patreon supporters, like he does every so often. Most names are familiar, long-time listeners who've followed his podcast for years. But today, one name stands out: Steve Pankey. At first, Robin doesn't think much of it, but then that name stirs something in his memory. Steve Pankey. It feels familiar, but not in a good way. And then it hits him. This is the same Steve Pankey who had been a person of interest in one of the coldest cases Robin had ever covered, the disappearance of Janelle Matthews. Back in 2017, Robin released episode 11 of his podcast. The case of Janelle Matthews was one that had haunted the small town of Greeley, Colorado, for decades. A young girl vanished without a trace, with no clues left behind. For 35 years, her case had gone cold. And now, here was Steve Pankey, someone deeply tied to that very case, supporting Robin's podcast. But it gets stranger. Let's go back to the beginning. December 20th, 1984 was a cold, quiet night in Greeley. 12-year-old Janelle Matthews had just returned home from her school's Christmas concert. Her friend's father dropped her off at 8:15 p.m. and the house was empty. Her father was at her sister's basketball game, and her mother was out of state, caring for a sick relative. Janelle did what she always did, placed her shoes and shawl by the heater to warm up. At around 8:30 p.m. the phone rang. She answered it and took a message for her father. That brief phone call would be the last time anyone heard from Janelle. When her father returned home at 9:30 p.m, he found the garage door open and her shoes still by the heater. But Janelle was gone. Panic quickly set in, and by 10:15 p.m, the police were on the scene. But there were no signs of a struggle, only faint footprints in the snow, leading up to the windows, as if someone had been watching. Janelle had simply vanished. Her disappearance attracted national attention. Janelle became one of the first milk carton kids, her face printed on milk cartons across the country in a nationwide effort to find missing children. President Ronald Reagan mentioned her in a speech on March 7, 1985, and her case was even entered into the congressional record. Despite all of this attention, no solid leads emerged. The case went cold, leaving Janelle's family with nothing but heartbreak. For 35 years, the case remained unsolved. That was until July 2019, when something horrifying was discovered. On July 23, 2019, a construction crew installing an oil pipeline stumbled upon human remains in a rural field 15 miles southeast of Greeley. Forensic analysis quickly confirmed that the remains belonged to Janelle Matthews. She had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. This discovery shocked the town of Greeley and reignited the investigation into Janelle's disappearance. But as the news broke, something else came to light. Steve Pankey. Just a few months earlier, in April 2019, Steve Pankey, a former Greeley resident, had made an unsolicited call to investigators, offering information about Janelle's disappearance. Pankey hadn't been a suspect back in 1984, and his sudden interest in the case, after over 30 years of silence, raised eyebrows. Pankey had lived just 3 miles from the Matthews home at the time of Janelle's disappearance, and he'd been a youth pastor at the same church the Matthews family attended. But until now, Pankey had never been formally connected to the case. On September 13, 2019, Greeley police publicly named Steve Pankey as a person of interest. His condo in Twin Falls, Idaho, was searched, and investigators discovered troubling evidence. Pankey had been inserting himself into the investigation for years, claiming to have knowledge of the crime while offering inconsistent stories. He had even demanded immunity in exchange for information. In interviews with the media, Pankey claimed he knew nothing about Janelle's disappearance. He said that on the night Janelle vanished, he and his wife were at home, packing for a Christmas trip to Big Bear Lake, California. But when police reviewed the documents he provided to back up his alibi, things weren't adding up. There were other disturbing signs too. After Janelle disappeared, Pankey reportedly began digging in his yard and disposed of a burned car at a salvage yard. His ex-wife, Angela Hicks, recounted how Pankey took an unusual interest in the case, forcing her to read him newspaper articles about Janelle's disappearance. She also recalled that Pankey listened intently to the radio, searching for updates on the case. But what made Steve Pankey's involvement even more disturbing was his obsession with true crime podcasts. He wasn't just a casual listener. Pankey financially supported multiple podcasts, including The Trail Went Cold, Already Gone, The Vanished, and Trace Evidence, shows that had covered Janelle's disappearance. Pankey was lurking in the shadows of the true crime community, listening to every detail about the case he was connected to. He was watching as podcasters like Robin Warder dissected the timeline, the evidence, and the suspects, including him. In October 2019, Pankey did something even more bizarre. He started giving interviews to podcasts and news outlets, telling his side of the story. On Unfound, a podcast dedicated to missing persons cases, Pankey spoke for over 3 hours, discussing his knowledge of Janelle's disappearance and his interactions with police. He sounded calm, almost too calm, like someone eager to control the narrative. For investigators, this behavior was alarming. Pankey wasn't just denying his involvement, he was actively engaging with the media, adding new details and theories, all while publicly claiming innocence. As investigators dug deeper into Steve Pankey's past, unsettling details began to surface. He had twice run for governor of Idaho and even self-published a novel, Graveyards, featuring characters that bore a suspicious resemblance to people from Greeley. He made odd, specific claims about the night Janelle disappeared, mentioning things like a rake being used to cover tracks in the snow, details that only someone close to the crime could know. On October 13, 2020, Steve Pankey was finally indicted on charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping in connection to Janelle Matthews' death. He was extradited to Colorado, where his trial took place. In court, Pankey's own words began to unravel his defense. Over the years, his statements had shifted, growing more inconsistent, revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond coincidence. On October 31, 2022, Pankey was convicted of kidnapping and taking the life of Janelle Matthews. His sentence, 20 years to life in prison, with his earliest chance for release in 2040, when he'll be 89 years old. Steve Pankey spent decades as a free man, blending into everyday life. But his chilling behavior didn't stop at the crime itself. Pankey inserted himself into the true crime community, lurking in the background, silently tracking the case of Janelle Matthews. He was a man who listened to podcasts dissecting the case he was tied to, hearing his name come up over and over again as investigators tried to uncover the truth. In the end, it wasn't just evidence that led to his arrest, it was Pankey's own actions. His obsessive engagement with the case, his constant attempts to stay involved, made it clear that the story of Janelle Matthews' disappearance wasn't just haunting the town of Greeley, it had haunted Steve Pankey himself. An attacker, hiding among the audience, listening as his own story unfolded. Pankey was finally caught, but the disturbing reality is that he spent years lurking, reliving the crime he committed, watching from behind a screen as the world tried to bring justice to Janelle Matthews. A true internet horror. The kind that shows us how even the darkest secrets can hide in the places we least expect.